So these two talks, I think what I'm going to do is just to tell you a little bit about the science that we're doing at 13BM, and mostly just the ideas. Okay, what you want to do, what kind of problems you have, how do you solve the problem. I'm not going to go through all the details about science because there's no time for that. Just some ideas. Hopefully that can stimulate some new ideas that come out. You've seen this many times, so I'm gonna skip this. The only thing we have is we have this software. We can do this analysis very quickly to look at the distortion of the lattice, and then you can calculate the stress. Okay. So let's go through a little bit about this. Tim showed you the hydrostatic versus non-hydrostatic diffraction lines. Hydrostatic is this circle in pink. Non-hydrostatic is just a white lines. Hydrostatic diffraction lines, when you cake it, meaning you unroll it, this spacing is independent of the azimuth angle, right? But when you apply a differential stress, this spacing becomes azimuth dependent. So what you do is you define these terms this is the term we use to fit the stress. Okay, so typically, you get these wiggles. These wiggles can be fit typically with this kind of formula. You have a Q factor, which is depending on the indices of your diffraction lines, HKL. And then you have these azimuth dependence. This is what we call Sin theory, right? In 1993, I think Sin presented this paper in Journal of Physics. So very simple. If you know the elastic constants along these directions, the shear modulus along these HKL directions, the differential stress, which is also dependent on the HKL, will be proportional to the Q factor with this constant 6 times G. Okay, that's the way we do it for most of the experiments, but there are exceptions that you can encounter during the experiments. I'll talk about that later. So in this deformation apparatus, we do deformation experiments in different regimes. We do ductile regime, which means you do creep experiments, material flows plastically. We also do brittle regime, where you introduce fracture in your sample. And we also can do anelasticity, meaning you measure attenuation of materials. As you oscillate materials actually consumes energy. This is very important for seismology. You want to understand how the seismic waves can attenuate through depths. And this is the very critical thing that we want to study. But this requires very, very small strains because you do not want to introduce a lot of plastic deformation, which is not the case for the seismic waves. So there's a huge amount of information you can get from these kind of deformation experiments. Because you get stress strain curves, right? That's the flow laws. And then you can get information about deformation mechanisms. So what kind of slip system is operating under different pressure and temperature and strain rate conditions? You can look at, since the differential stress we directly measure are dependent on the HKL, you want to get a bulk to average bulk stress, and that requires some modeling, which we use either elastoplastic, or these days we do elasto-viscoplastic self-consistent modeling. And you get also Paul figures, which tells you the texture of the sample after controlled deformation. And this texture information, again, can be plugged into the models to get your active slip systems. And also you can use this to estimate seismic anisotropy of the materials after deformation. And of course, all of these can be applied to single crystal or single phase or multi-phase. You can take different phases in the sample. And since diffraction is so powerful, you can actually pick up which phase, which peak belong to which phase, and what they deform, what kind of mechanism they have. The new techniques like a high energy diffraction microscope, you actually can spin your sample. You collect multi-grain diffraction data as Andy described. And you do this by rotating the sample, and then you can reconstruct the elastic tensors, the stress tensor on each grain if you can resolve these grains. This is a very powerful technique. And you also can get grain level interactions. For example, when Wendu talked about the perk deformation experiments using the tomography, you can actually, tomography tells you how each individual grains deform during deformation. Okay, and if you combine that with the HEDM, you can get, theoretically, you can get the strain tensor within each grains. So then you can tell how these grains are talking to each other during the deformation. So there's a lot of very interesting things that can happen during the deformation performance. And with this technique, you can also couple, as Matt given, different in situ probes, not only X-rays. You do ultrasound. We can also do acoustic emission and also electrical conductivity measurements at the same time. So there's just many things, many different combinations of things that you can think of during for your project. So this is one example about flow laws, right? This is Antiga. So this is many years ago, 2007. Nadesh was one of my postdocs. So she measured these flow laws of the Antiga, and she fit the creep laws, and she estimated the visco relaxation of the Antiga during subduction zone conditions. And the conclusion was, at that time, that the Antiga, if you have Antiga layer between the crust and your subducting slab, this layer is so weak, even compared with wet olivine, that most of the deformation will be concentrated in that layer. And then when you accumulate enough energy, this layer would all of a sudden slip, generating earthquakes. And this year, in Science, actually, they found this in Japan. When they drill the subduction zone near the Tohoku earthquake, they found a very thin layer, about a few meters of Antiga, which is kind of indicates this conclusion. And Matt showed some of the fit using the elastomoplastic self-consistent model to look at the olivine flow laws. Here, again, this was Nadesh's work, 2012. So by fitting this observation, these different symbols using different slip systems, you can actually sort of back out what systems are activating at what conditions. So you have this 001, 100 system dropping like that, and then you have a new slip system 010, 100 coming up. With all of these fit, this modeling can tell you what kind of mechanism during deformation, how things are changing. So in fact, this experiment that showed that you have a switch between different dominant deformation mechanism would be switching from this to that as the pressure goes up. That's actually consistent with our previous studies. Of course, at the same time, the monochromatic diffraction data can give you this texture information. So from the observation, you fit the data. So every panel is a pair. You can see the fit. This gives you the pole figures, which then can be used to calculate seismic anisotropy. You can do multi-phase experiments. This is an example of analog bridgmanite with MgO. So this is like an analog of lower mantle. When you conduct deformation experiments, you get the Q factors as a function of different temperature at certain pressures. You can see the enstatite bridgmanite diffractions are much stronger than the MgO stroke. And then you can use this Q factors convert to stress on different conditions. So you basically get the Bridgmanite deformation stress strain curves versus the MGO stress strain curves. At the same time, you get texture information. So you can tell what the texture the perovskite structure is developing and what texture of the MGO structure is developing. A recent example would be the mixture of olivine and antiquarite. And here is Jin Zhang's group from New Mexico. Now she's at Texas A&M. Looking at the subduction zone materials, the mixture of olivine and antiquarite. This shows the example of 50-50 mixture during deformation. So they can get the texture information and they can use the elastoplastic self-consistent modeling to match the observation. And then on olivine, on antiquarite, there are fewer peaks, so they could not really do the theoretical modeling. But from that information, they actually can calculate the seismic anisotropy of the subducting slag materials. This is an example of HCP iron. So it's a candidate core material. Of course, we can't do the deformation at 150 GPa. We did it at 15 GPa, 10 times lower the pressure at some temperature. But the idea is the same. So you measure these Q factors, and then you use self-consistent models to model them. Then you can see the first deformation mechanism, dominant mechanism, is actually twinning in this HCP iron. And then twinning drops down this blue curve, and the slips start to dominate the deformation system. This will tell you how the texture will develop. And as we know, that the outer core is highly anisotropic. So understanding the texture is actually important. And I'll skip some of these. This is another interesting example of this material. Again, it's the HCP. The metal is a zinc. It's got a twinning behavior, what they call the androgynous behavior. That is, on one side, the twin is positive, the other side, the twin is negative, the same twinning. And at only one point, when the C/A ratio equals exactly square root of 3, there's no twinning. So after conducting the experiments, this group were able to determine what different mechanisms, deformation mechanism happening during when the CO ratio is very close to square root of 3, you only have dislocation slips. Above and below, you have significant twinning going on. And so they can model this. I'm going to skip that. And this is an example to show how the scene theory can break down. So this is a super hard material. This is nanoplastic diamonds. And it's a typical grain size is about 100 nanometers compared to the typical commercially available polycrystalline diamond composite. This is like 20 microns or so grain size. At 10 GPa, 1200 degrees Celsius, the material is really strong. You can see that material, as you deform the sample strain versus stress curve, it goes straight up parallel to the elastic constant first, and then start yield, and then eventually saturates. And overall, this stress is about 3 times that of typical commercialized polycrystalline diamonds. Well, if you look at the Cape pattern, you analyze the Cape pattern, what's really interesting is beyond this point, the red dots, no matter how hard you deform the material, you will not exceed this part of in the Q factor on the D spacing. So what happens is the material seems to have hit on the really, really hard wall. It doesn't deform anymore. So you basically only broaden these troughs. So basically, this fit that I showed you earlier breaks down. And so you have to really keep in mind, if there are several materials that are exceptions, you can't really just blindly just use things theory to fit everything. And what happens essentially is you have the dashed hydrostatic circle. After deformation, you're supposed to get ellipsoid, but you're not. So all of a sudden, this material has intrinsic strength that just blocks this dark blue part. So you have to use some different ways to analyze the stress. And this has something to do with the deformation mechanism. And our conclusion is, just show you this, is what they call, it's actually well-known behavior in material science is basically lattice rotation. So basically the diamond lattice breaks down into very small parts, very small parts with a lot of twinning and tiny disturbance. They're not even dislocations, they're partial dislocations, or some people call that nano disturbances. They always appear in pairs. So if you look at the TEM electron diffraction, you see these peaks get very, very broad. So the distribution of the diffraction spot are just spread out due to these kind of disturbances. And this is the only material that I know of that has this behavior. I hope that we can find some more examples on this. So Tim has, here. Tim, did you explain to the audience about these tails?
No.
So you wonder why these each animal has this tail. This is the acoustic emission transducer that we push behind each animal. And using this, we can generate brittle deformation at the same time monitoring the energy burst that this fracturing generates. So of course, we know this. One of the examples where we do many different types of experiments using acoustic emission. One of the examples to understand the deep focus earthquake mechanisms. We look at the, we can't really do the real silicate ringwoodite or wassevite at 12, 14 GPa, but we have a number of different materials, analog Mg2GeO4 or Mn2GeO4. This one transforms directly from olivine to ringwoodite. This one transforms to wassevite. And then we have the iron-rich silicated materials. So we basically apply the pressure of these materials to the high pressure phase condition. We heat it up and while deforming it. And in all these cases, as the material starts transforming, it generates acoustic emission signals showing cracks. These are the fractures that we observe after we recover the experiment. But during the experiment, you can see all these events. Both as you start deforming, the events seem to be lower, and then the rate gets higher and higher until some point it's just the sample just fail. And when we work with seismologists, we can actually locate these events. And these are the okay. Anyway, so what I intended to show is you have events that happens during the deformation. They're parallel to these fault traces. For some reason, my movies don't work, but that's okay. And Tim actually also looked at these acoustic emission events and conducted a lot of coda wave analysis in collaboration with the seismologists at Caltech. So here, what he got is the corner frequency versus the amplitude of the moment magnitude of the earthquakes, or nano earthquakes in our experiments. And you can see this general trend, which actually goes really well with all these seismic observations from hundreds of kilometer fault sizes all the way down to centimeter fault sizes. In our case, our small event fault sizes are like a few microns, and they all show pretty well defined trend. It hints that even at laboratory scales, the behavior is actually generally consistent. And so, in fact, if you look at more details, so below a critical magnitude, the stress drop is lower, whereas in the other way around. Sorry, below this magnitude, the stress drop is higher in amplitude. This is because you have to crack individual grains in order to the grain to these fractures to connect to the next grains and so on, so that the fault can propagate. So when you crack the individual grains, it requires higher stress drop, and then it becomes more or less consistent with the seismic observations, basically typically like 2 or 3 MPa per, that kind of stress drop. Last example is the anelasticity. So here's an example of recent studies about lower mantle. They have this low, high attenuation, low Q area around 1,000 kilometer depth. And there's a lot of studies. Tony Brookett actually pioneered the study of oscillating experiments to measure the attenuations. In our case, we measure the strain in 2 ways. We can do the strain by using the images and doing digital imaging correlation, and you get kind of the resolution about 10 to the minus 4. But you can also use travel times. As long as your strain is very small, you don't change the texture. So you can assume that the velocities of the sample is constant. The travel time basically tells you the length change. And in that case, you get the resolution to the few times 10 to the minus 5. And we know the seismic amplitude is typically 10 to the minus 6. So we're getting pretty close. And so this is one analog Bridgman night. As you oscillate, you make the sample shorter and longer, you oscillate, you can see this diffraction peak. It's actually changing back and forth. And as you do that, that is because you're actually twinning the sample. The lattice changes, the A and C axis are changing due to the stress. And that generates hysteresis loops, which is the energy consumed during this kind of wave propagation. So here's one example that we obtained at ESRF beamlines. You can actually measure the hysteresis loop in this material. So there's a lot of potential applications of this kind of experiments. Very quickly, we have another apparatus which is out of commission right now. We're trying to fix it. We've been using that for like 20-some years. It's a high-pressure tomography apparatus. You can conduct tomography imaging under pressure, but more importantly, you can rotate the top and bottom angles like shown in here in opposite direction. So then you generate a shear deformation on samples. So an originally flat plane like that will be twisted like that. And then you can look at a lot of multi-phase texture development. Here's an example. This is a olivine with a lot of FES melt in it. This is before the torsional deformation. So you have removed the olivine matrix. This is all FES pockets. After a lot of shear deformation, the FES form this kind of bands. This is a known phenomena, right? You have a very weak material like a melt. As you twist the composite, and the melt will try to aggregate, and then it will develop very weak shear planes, which are roughly 10, 20 degrees from the horizontal plane. And this can be used to model, for example, how the melt segregate in the mantle and how the core can be formed during accretion. Finally, when Lou and Andy showed some science images about triaxial deformation, you deform the sample triaxially, then you can conduct tomography image and look at how the crack is developing, how the microstructure is changing. This is one of the apparatuses that we have developed. There's a couple apparatus that have been used at beam lines. Our goal eventually is to incorporate acoustic velocity measurements and acoustic emission measurements. So that will give you more information in one experiment to help better understand the physical processes. Here's another one. I think that's it. So, just in time, 12 gone. It's a lunchtime, but before we disappear, any questions, comments?
For the lattice rotations, talking about how nanodisturbances or like partial dislocations always happen in pairs. Why is that? Like why always pairs?
Well, it's in pairs because you have overall the grain has to be balanced, right? So it's like also like the partial dislocations. There's a requirement about charge balance. There's also a requirement about stress balance. So typically these things happen, they're balanced. Of course, this is before these defects start propagating. When they start propagating, then temporarily you have imbalance. Yeah.
Okay.